So, medieval armor. Let's get started. Also, keep in mind, I am going to be generalizing just because this is a quick overview. So if I miss something or I say something that is not quite correct, I apologize. Light armor, as I am defining it, just for the purposes of this, is basically just clothing in terms of encumbrance, in terms of weight, that type of thing, movement restriction, etc. Whereas medium armor is going to be probably very heavy, actually, in terms of weight, but it's sort of in a medium era of protection, as well as heavy armor is obviously, that's the highest level of protection you can get, and probably going to be quite heavy as well in terms of weight. So for light armor, we have the gambeson, which is armor made of quilted fabric layers. And it was probably more protective than you might think, but still not great. It's pretty lacking in protection compared to other types of armor, and so basically if you could afford better, probably wear armor on top of a gambeson, which was also called an accaton or an arming doublet sometimes. So the primary use was kind of like the lowest ends of armor, as well as a padding underneath other types of armor. Leather armor is pretty misunderstood by most people, and like a staple of fantasy and post-apocalyptic is just like these like leather jackets, basically. They're just made of thin leather, and it's like stopping bullets and crap. Like, no, that's not going to protect you against a bullet or a sword or anything like that. What you need to do is make it into thick layers. You need that leather to be very thick, almost into plates almost. And it'd probably look a lot more like plate armor than it would like a gambeson or like clothing as it's usually shown. It probably would have been pretty good protection, but again, not in comparison to other types of armor, kind of in the similar boat as gambeson, but it couldn't really be worn like on underneath anything else, so it was kind of in an awkward position. So for medium armor, we have mail, which is armor made of metal rings. In modern times, we usually use chainmail, which is not technically the right term, but whatever. That is made of butted mail, which basically means it's just like rings that are just like crammed together, which is not really what we're talking about much in terms of actual historical pieces. What you'd want to do is have riveted mail by riveting the rings together, holding it together pretty well. And a lot of people have the idea that this is like not very good armor, but that's actually pretty mistaken. During like the early to high Middle Ages, this stuff was like the creme de la creme, even from going back to like ancient times to up really until plate armor was made common. It's very heavy, not quite as good as plate, but pretty good. You're still probably going to want to use a shield, meaning it stays in the medium category, but still, it's some pretty good stuff, actually, despite popular opinion. The Brigandine? Yes. Personally, the Brigandine is my favorite armor type. Is similar to the earlier coat of plates, and was probably inspired by many Asian designs when used in Europe. And it was a series of overlapping steel plates held together by a fabric or leather jacket. This was usually used by common soldiers, just because it was cheaper than plate armor, but still really good protection. But also used by the rich, by the knights, by the kings and nobility, because it was damn stylish, okay? You can't color metal plates, but you can with fabric, which is really what outwardly it looks like. So it was pretty stylish, a little bit more comfortable than plate armor, not to an insane degree, and a little lighter usually. So people really did like this type of armor, but it was still not nearly as good as plate. This is not studded leather. Do not call it studded leather. Brigandine is cool, studded leather is not. Studded leather is the dumbest concept ever invented, adding tiny little metal naily bits on a leather jacket isn't going to do anything. We already talked about how the leather jacket isn't going to do anything, so adding a bunch of little nails to it is not going to do crap, okay? Even if the enemy, however unlikely, had a direct hit on the stud, it would just bounce off and go into the leather jacket and cut you. But probably where this originated, though, is that it kind of looks like when you look at the outside of a brigandine, you see the little studs, the little rivets coming through the fabric, and people see that and they're like, oh yeah, those must be what's protecting it. No, that's actually holding in the plates that are the protection, and it looks really cool. It's just that when you don't have the proper context, it seems kind of odd, and people attribute it to studded leather when really it's the brigandine. Often portrayed in role-playing games is half plate, which it really isn't a exact, like, it's not an armor type, but depending on the purposes that you're doing it, you might want to take off certain parts of the armor, either because you can't afford that piece of armor, because you want to be lighter, because that part of your body is already protected by some other piece, like a shield or something like that. So it all really depends on the context. Like, archers probably not going to want to wear heavy vambraces and pauldrons because that'll tire out their arms, which is very important when you're shooting a bow. Stuff like that. And of course, full plate armor. This is the best medieval armor, bar none. Developed mostly in the late Middle Ages, this is the pinnacle of armor technology of its day. Put somebody on a horse, train them their whole lives in the cruel art of warfare, and wearing full plate, they were like the heavy tanks of their day. You know, trying to cut this stuff with a sword, good luck, you're not going to be able to. These suits were so good that historical manuals recommend literally hitting the opponent with the wrong end of the sword to take advantage of the huge air quotes weakness of blunt force rather than wasting your time with the blade. By weakness, I really don't mean weakness. Simply, it's just a technique that has a better chance if you hit them in one of the weaker points of it, of actually doing something. But still, like, an arrow is not going to do anything. Some of these could even deflect early firearms. So basically what you want to do is use blunt weapons like maces, warhammers, polearms, that type of thing, and go for the joints and stuff like that. But even then, they were usually wearing mail and a gambeson underneath that. So these were pretty hard to take out. And at this point, people stopped really using shields very commonly once the full plate became like a real thing. It was good enough protection that you didn't really need the extra protection of a shield, and then you could fight better with a two-handed weapon and deal a lot more damage. So that improved not only your defensive capability, but also your offensive capability because of that. Now, there are weaknesses, don't get me wrong, first of all. And of course, there was a range of quality, no matter what. When I say it was invulnerable, I'm talking about it in very high-quality, battle-ready, guild-made kits. Not necessarily the cheap garbage you probably could have bought from some unlicensed farrier. And in the same way, if you buy a crappy armored vest, it's not going to be nearly as good as an expensive armored vest. But really, like, when we're talking about knights, they were rich. They could afford really nice pieces of armor. The image of a knight so encumbered that he can't even get onto his horse without a crane is just nonsense. Okay? People wouldn't have worn armor if it did that, okay? They'd sink in the mud or trip or something and get killed in a few minutes in an actual battle. A steel plate is a steel plate. It doesn't need to be nearly as thick as people realize to give you adequate protection. You take a sword to any real steel plate of any even not very good quality, it's not going through. So it would not have been nearly as heavy as is often portrayed. And wearing any type of armor, you'd want to wear it with a belt, distribute the weight between different points of your body in order to reduce that weight that's already there. And your range of motion is definitely going to be taken out, but there were joints and stuff, so definitely in terms of endurance, just due to the weight, and range of motion, you're going to be much worse than an unarmored soldier. But I still think that these outweighed most of the negatives because people did use these suits of armor in real life. And obviously they can take a knife, dagger, whatever, go through an eye slit or something like that. And that was a very common way of taking them out. But ultimately, this was the best armor they had at the time, just because it protected the areas it protected it really well. And it really was, you had to play to the weaknesses just to even deal any damage at all. So the main takeaways are that Brigandine, mail, and plate were the coolest, and leather armor, and God forbid studded leather, were awful. In all seriousness, people wore armor for protection. They wore exactly what degree armor they needed, none more so as to keep mobility and endurance high, but none less because, they didn't want to die. So hopefully this was helpful, and for any writers or medieval enthusiasts in understanding types of armor, eventually armor began to be used less and less as the need for heavy infantry and shock cavalry waned, with gunpowder ruling the battlefield, and Europe becoming dominated by nation-states with professional armies rather than feudal confederations. Gone were the days of tin can equestrian aristocrats mowing down hordes of unrestrained peasant conscripts. As feudalism died, so too did the use of armor. And as the use of armor declined, so too did my interest in history. I mean, obviously, sure, we don't have smallpox or bubonic plague, aristocratic stratification, and oppressive theocracy, but at what cost? We have no castles, no swords, no brigandines. And without brigandines, what's even the point? This has been Chosen One, signing off.